Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sexual Assault Victim Advocate Fundamentals training series. Today is day 4 of this training series, and today's presentation is on the neurobiology of trauma. Before we begin, I would like to start off by saying today's training may contain sensitive subject matter and may cause participants to experience strong emotions or strong emotional reactions. So we encourage you to take care of yourself during today's training and reach out to your support networks for help if needed. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters for today so they can introduce themselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's SAVAT session on the neurobiology of trauma and trauma-informed response. My name is Summer Gaines Wheeler. I am the Sexual Assault Forensic Exam and Sexual Assault Response Team Policy Advocate with MCASA, and I'm also joined by my lovely colleague, Cameron. So, Cameron, if you would like to introduce yourself, and then we'll get things started.
Hi everyone, I'm Cameron and I'm the Sexual Assault Response Team and Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Policy Advocate with MCASA.
Perfect. So we have a couple of SMART objectives. You guys have probably seen the SMART objectives for a majority of these SAVAT sessions, but with regards to this training, we hope that by the end of this training session, you'll be able to, 1, identify at least 4 symptoms of trauma, 2, describe the 5 components of the defense cascade, 3, compare and contrast bottom up versus top down attention. And 4, apply informed techniques when working with survivors. Next slide, please. I think we should have a little sticky note activity. I'm not sure if it's available, Alyssa.
Yeah, just a second. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard for everyone.
All right, so for this activity, we would like for you guys to type into each category. So you'll see we have what I know, what I wonder, and what I learned. If you guys are able and willing to add any comments that you guys have regarding what you would like to know, what you have learned at the end of the session, and what you already know about the neurobiology of trauma, that would be great. If you guys are experiencing any technical difficulties and would prefer to use a chat, that's also encouraged as well. We just want to, get your guys' opinions. We really value and appreciate your guys' participation for all these SAVAT sessions. So we'll give it a few moments and then we'll reconvene. And then what I will say is for the what I learned portion, you guys can fill that out at the very end of this training session. We'll have this slide back up. Perfect. I'll give it a few more moments. You guys are giving some really great responses. Thank you. If you can't get the sticky note to work, no problem. Just feel free to type anything that you guys have in mind in the chat. All feedback is welcomed. So a lot of the what I knows so far are feeling ashamed, isolation, numbing, chaos, helplessness, anger, afraid to reach out to others. Absolutely. What you guys wonder are the effects forever. Um, can you heal from trauma? If someone has a lack of resources available. Perfect. Um, so I'll give it like maybe 5 more seconds and then we can proceed with actually getting into the content and hopefully answering some of the questions that you guys have, as well as learning more about the content of what you might already know. Really great responses, guys. All right. I think we are good to move forward. Thank you guys for your participation. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Cameron, for sharing your screen. Okay, so now to actually get into the content of trauma. We first want to actually talk about what the definition is, right? So, trauma is a normal emotional response to an extremely distressing event. And I want to point out two key terms used in this definition. The first word being normal. I really want to emphasize that no matter how someone is processing trauma, it's a very much valid and normal response. And it's important to emphasize that because you might encounter survivors or anyone for that matter who's experiencing some sort of trauma in their life partake in behaviors that may seem otherwise abnormal. But when we are discussing trauma, it is a completely normal way to process what has just occurred. So, for example, if someone has experienced a distressing event and is lying in bed all day, maybe not, getting outside as much, to some, that may seem abnormal, but given what has occurred, that is a completely normal, valid response. And you will continue to hear me reiterate that throughout this entire training. And another important term that's used in this definition is the word distressing. And this can vary from person to person, meaning this is something that we get to decide individually on. So what may be extremely distressing to me or someone else may not be as traumatic to someone else that may be dealing with that same experience. So it may not be as negatively impactful to someone else. It is subjective, right? So we really want to remind survivors that what they went through is still traumatic, so we can validate them, as well as alleviate any self-blame and guilt. Next slide, please. So we really want to get you guys engaged in this presentation. I know it's a lot of content to get through, but if you feel comfortable, could you guys please maybe share some examples of events that can lead to trauma? We'll give it a few minutes, and I'll try to keep my eye out on the chat as well. Car accident, neglect, child sexual abuse, divorce, school shooting, mass shooting, loss of job. These are all really great responses. Sexual abuse, manipulation, witnessing a crime, absolutely. Death in the family. Domestic violence, drug use, rape, financial instability, medical malpractice, physical abuse, family separation. Yeah, so you guys are giving really great responses. This is awesome. Yeah, so as you can see, there are plenty of events that can lead to trauma, and you guys have listed a ton, right? Community violence, whether that's, a mugging or physical sexual assault, bullying, shooting, sexual and or physical abuse, natural disasters like a hurricane, flood, fire, earthquake. I think I saw you guys also mention being in or actually witnessing some sort of crime or accident, like a car accident. Some other examples include social shaming. That's a good one. Sudden, unexpected, or violent death of someone, whether it be accidental or a suicide or homicide, serious injury, war, or political violence, right? So it's clear that there are so many different events that can lead to trauma. And I also want to bring up that survivors who are experiencing trauma from a sexual assault may already also be experiencing trauma from other personal matters. So when we compound all those levels of trauma, that can be extremely traumatic over time for someone. And we really want to ensure that we are supporting survivors as best as possible, with that in mind. So I appreciate your guys' responses. And we're actually going to have another engagement activity in the next slide. So how do you think someone experiencing trauma would behave after learning about trauma? What are some behaviors that you think would come up for someone? Angry, isolation, anxiety, embarrassed, fearful, anxious, absolutely. Rebellion, depression, sleeping too much, flashbacks, panic attacks, all great responses, guys. Withdrawn, poor hygiene, lack of self-confidence. You guys are listing great examples. Someone made a good point. It varies from person to person. Absolutely. Aggressiveness, lack of trust. Yeah. So these are all great answers. And I really appreciate you guys coming through with all this participation. And you can continue to list some more examples as I continue on with the content. But yeah, we see that, crying, hyperventilating, kind of being numb and out of it or in shock are all examples. You may also encounter someone who is the complete opposite and may come off very happy, making jokes, whether it be about the experience itself or just coming off very lighthearted and positive after a traumatic experience. And these examples that you guys are listing all go back to the idea that responses to trauma may seem abnormal behaviors to some, right? Some of them may seem normal to others, but regardless, we want to remember and keep in mind that they are all valid, normal responses, and there is no one way or one correct way to react, right? These are all coping mechanisms for what distressing event they have just endured. So thank you guys for all of your participation. And then I think we can move on to the next slide, and Cameron, you can take over.
Awesome. So now we're going to discuss the official definition of trauma and the symptoms someone who has experienced trauma may demonstrate. I want to point out that I'm going to be referencing the DSM-5 definition as well as their criteria for PTSD diagnosis. So keep in mind that it's simply a diagnostic tool, so someone may not fit perfectly into this definitions box. Not all survivors of sexual assault or trauma in general will necessarily meet this criteria for a formal diagnosis of PTSD, but this does not mean they're not experiencing it. And it's normal and does not invalidate or suggest the trauma they experienced was not real or not bad enough. The first criteria that the DSM-5 provides for a diagnosis of PTSD is simply that a person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence. It's important in this diagnosis is direct exposure or witnessing trauma, meaning indirect exposure. For example, indirect exposure to the details of trauma usually happens for many professionals in our field, like first responders, medics, nurses, advocates. It's our job to talk to these people about what happened. And when we do that, we experience indirect exposure. And other indirect exposure can include learning the experiences of a close friend or family member exposed to trauma. So it's just really important to note that it doesn't single anyone out. It will also impact people who are just told about incidents. So it's important that everyone takes care of themselves. And now we're going to talk about the symptoms in PTSD, again, based on the DSM-5. These are just some of the symptoms you may see in survivors you work with. So keep in mind, this is not one size fits all. Survivors may re-experience the event, and this may look like unwanted memories, nightmares, and flashbacks. They may also display avoidance behaviors, which I saw a lot of you mention, meaning they avoid trauma-related reminders. So survivors may avoid certain locations that may remind them of the event or where the event took place. This is really common in sexual assaults that happen on college campuses. We see a lot of students who will alter the route they take to campus or change their schedule simply so they aren't reminded of what happened to them on a certain part of campus. Survivors can also isolate themselves further, which was another answer I saw pop up a lot, and experience negative thoughts or feelings, or even the flat effect. This can look like decreased interest in things they used to enjoy. It is important to note that these symptoms look different in every person, and everyone experiences them at varying degrees. And I saw a lot of you mention that in the chat as well, that it's going to look different from person to person. So it's really important that we keep all of that in mind.
All right, so when we look at the data, we can see that 7.8% of the United States' population will experience and be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. And of that 7.8% who experience PTSD, 31% are sexual assault survivors. And yes, while that is less than half, it is a fairly large percentage of individuals who are experiencing trauma. And these numbers don't even reflect the individuals who didn't meet the requirements to be diagnosed professionally. And we will also see that 94% of women experience trauma symptoms 2 weeks after an assault. So this is also showcasing that trauma symptoms may set in immediately.
Okay, so now we're going to launch a poll where I just want you guys to answer this question. How many reports of sexual assault are false, do you think? The reason we bring this up with neuro is because it's really important to know where the research is coming from so that we aren't misled. Okay, we have a lot of answers coming in. Majority, 91% of you are saying that it's less than 10%. There's some 25%. No, 50% or 75%, which is good. Okay, awesome. So I guess, yeah, 90% of you said less than 10%, which is fantastic. So accepted evidence-based research shows that the true rate of false reports for sexual assault is somewhere between 3% and 8%. And it's really important to note that this is no different than other false reporting rates for other crimes. I think it's a really common misconception that sexual assault is falsely reported at higher rates, and that is not true. When someone is sexually assaulted, they may behave in ways that some people find difficult to understand, and these behaviors often lead to victims being disbelieved about their assault, but their behaviors are, in fact, normal neurobiological responses to trauma. So I want to talk about where this perception around false reporting came from so that we understand why it's incorrect. In 1996, Eugene Koenen published a study finding that 41% of rape accusations in a police agency were false and filed to provide an alibi, seek revenge, or obtain sympathy and attention. Victims were told that they would have to take a polygraph, and if their account was not able to be proven, they would be charged with a false report. But this study also only reviewed files from one single unnamed agency without any independent oversight, so just was not a valid study at all. There are many different regions of the brain that are impacted by trauma, and today we're going to continue to learn more about trauma in the brain.
Yes, and real quick, I did see a question in the chat where someone was asking, was it women may only show trauma symptoms only 2 weeks after and not before? And apologies if I'm misinterpreting your question, but the statistic was 94% of women experience trauma symptoms 2 weeks after an assault. So I think what that statistic is trying to signify is that you can encounter a lot of survivors, and in this specific statistic, women who aren't presenting those trauma symptoms. And so we still don't want to invalidate their trauma, their experience, and what they went through, just because, once again, we may think that they're behaving in a normal or abnormal way. I hope that answers your question. But to continue on with the neurobiology of trauma, right? We obviously, like I just said, don't want to assume that someone is not being honest about their assault just because the behaviors may not align with what we deem a normal response is. And we will begin to discuss this as we go into the neurobiology of trauma. And what we will see in this presentation is that there are many different regions of the brain that are quite literally impacted by trauma. Today, we're just going to discuss a few. And Cameron will actually show a really helpful trauma and brain video in the next slide.
So I do just want to give you guys a heads up. This video is about 10 minutes long and there will be closed captions on. The speakers do have a Scottish accent, so the captions may not be perfectly accurate, but they are more or less accurate.
We need to take a statement so we can...
Sorry, I'm trying to turn the captions on. Oh my God.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat? What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember. Would your pals remember what time you left the club? He seemed nice. She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are three possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later, but in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the three parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma? War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression. Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress.
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. Can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
Okay, so I hope that video was a good starting point for all of you. We're going to unpack a lot of the concepts mentioned in that video a little bit further.
Thank you, Cameron. So before we move on to our next topic, I just want to discuss a technique that was mentioned in that video, which is the forensic experiential trauma interviewing, also known as FETI. It was created by a former special agent, Russell Strand, and the purpose of this is to collect as much forensic and physical evidence as possible. So you could see that it was encompassing tools that focus on helping survivors recall information. And this is broken down into a couple of steps that are listed on the screen, right? So step 1 would be expressing genuine empathy or expressing sorrow for what has happened to that client, or I should say survivor. And this really helps build rapport between you guys. Step 2, using sentences similar to help me understand what you are able to remember from the experience, right? So not making it so much about the chronological order of the narrative, but more so what the survivor can actually recall, and then you can build on from there. And then step 3 would be to listen, right? Listen to what the survivor is sharing and make sure that they acknowledge the difficulty of the situation while also understanding that the neurobiology of trauma to help survivors recall the information. So you can use other statements such as, what are you able to tell me about the experience? Can you clarify this or that? What was the most difficult part of the experience for you? What, if anything, can you not forget about this experience? And then kind of clarifying other information and details as you guys go on. But overall, it is really important to focus on what they can remember. So instead of focusing on that specific narrative, see if the survivor remembers specific sounds or colors or sensations or pleasure and pain. Those sort of things you guys can continue to build on to draw out more information.
So I want to talk about some guidelines that the International Association of Chiefs of Police set for officer-involved shootings. So this is when how police agencies should respond after an officer fires a weapon directed towards civilian populations. So the IACP recommends that officers who fired a weapon or were directly involved in a critical incident should be encouraged to step away immediately from the scene and be transported to a safe and supportive environment by a trusted peer or supervisor. While officers may be asked to provide pertinent information soon after a shooting to aid the initial investigation, officers should have recovery time before providing a full formal statement. And depending on the nature of the incident and the demands of the agency and the emotional and physical status of the officers, this range can be anywhere from a few hours to several days. And I bring your attention to this because if we are expecting officers to meet these elements, we should also expect this for survivors of sexual assault. They should also have access to a safe space, access to a confidential advocate, and they should be allowed at least one full sleep cycle. But giving them the time they need is something that's really important.
So now that we've discussed a lot of background information, we can finally discuss the neurobiology of trauma a little bit more in depth, especially with regards to the brain itself. So you guys can see that I've listed two parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is the front part of the brain, and this controls normal thoughts and actions. It is essentially your executive function that allows you to plan, goal set, participate in decision making, that sort of thing. For example, it's activated for you guys right now because you're listening to this presentation, right? And then next is the amygdala, and that's a smaller part of the brain, and that scans for environmental threats. I believe it also has to do with emotions as well. But like the prefrontal cortex, it is always active. And a helpful way to remember the amygdala is thinking of it as the fear center. It notifies you when you are in a dangerous situation. It's kind of like going off when something does not feel right. So when the amygdala starts to go off, the prefrontal cortex goes down, and it shifts focus away from everyday tasks to the fear that you may be experiencing from environmental threats. So you begin to lose your ability to plan and goal set and to comply with if this, then that, right? Those things that are made possible by the prefrontal cortex. A good way to think of this is, for example, let's say you're sitting outside on a bench, you're trying to enjoy your alone time, you're reading a book maybe, you're focused on reading, and you suddenly notice that someone is staring at you rather intensely, right? You're most likely going to feel very uncomfortable, deeply unsettled, and you can no longer focus on reading because your amygdala is going off. And whereas your prefrontal cortex would typically use executive functioning to say, hey, maybe we want to get out of the situation and read somewhere else, or maybe even call a friend or just do something to get out of the situation. You're not able to really do that because you're so focused on fear that your amygdala is going off, and your focus on environmental threats may prevent this other functioning from making a different sort of decision.
So next I'm going to talk to you all about the HPA axis. The H is for hypothalamus, P, pituitary gland, and then A is for the adrenal glands. And the hypothalamus is often described as grand central station of the brain. This is the best way to think of it. Its primary purpose is to communicate to the other structures in the brain and the body about what needs to happen. So this is where like everything is happening. One structure that the hypothalamus is going to communicate to is the pituitary gland, which is often referred to as the master gland. And this is the gland that then communicates to other glands throughout the body. And in the instance of a traumatic event, the gland that it's going to be communicating with is the adrenal gland. And these three structures are what create the HPA axis. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary, which signals the adrenal. And that signal is that something bad is about to happen to the body, and there needs to be a hormonal release to help the body respond to what is happening. And the adrenal gland's response is to flood the body with chemicals and hormones to help cope with that trauma. So I'm going to talk about the stress hormones that the adrenal glands will release to help cope with these events. The first one I want to talk about is a catecholamine, and this is the most common one, and we mostly know it as adrenaline. These are the hormones that would be coursing through the body to help with the fight response in the event that the body was going to be fighting back against the traumatic event that's about to happen to it. The catecholamines can also be helpful in response to the flee aspect of fight, flight, or freeze. You want to try to run away, to try to get away from the threatening situation. So catecholamines are helpful for the fight or flight response. In conjunction with that, we have cortisol. Cortisol is typically referred to as a stress hormone. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Cortisol levels are going to affect the amount of energy that the body has to fight back or try to flee the situation. We then have opiates, and those serve to blunt possible physical pain. Opiates blunt physical pain, but then we also have oxytocin, which is released in order to try to increase positive feelings. You may think, why is our body trying to create positive feelings if we're going through a traumatic situation? And it's hard to do when one is experiencing physical and emotional pain, but the body is doing that to kind of even out like your body's response. And the body will release opiates, which is the natural morphine in the body. And the release of these opiates and the oxytocin will help in blunting the physical and emotional pain you are experiencing. The unfortunate situation is that we as humans do have a cyclical effect. The amygdala shuts off the prefrontal cortex, which is what Summer was just telling you all about. And that tells the HPA axis to release all the stress hormones, meaning that our planning and executive function further shuts down. This is where we rely on learned behaviors, but most of us do not have learned behaviors to fall back on. Every one of us has the neurobiological response to trauma, and that means that all of us have this response. So how do we counteract that response to avoid everyone just having to fight, flight, or freeze? Folks in the military or law enforcement and even some healthcare professionals meet that gap with trainings. And the idea is that they can build learned behaviors and habits. So when their stress response kicks in, they're able to fall back on these learned behaviors and know how to react. Sexual assault survivors are not receiving this training, and they should not have to. But that is why we see different reactions out of sexual assault survivors than we do other people who deal with traumatic instances.
So now that we have discussed fear and our bodily reactions to fear, we can also now move on to memory. The hippocampus is responsible for memory. Like in the video, it's like a filing system. So when experiencing trauma, energy then shifts to the amygdala, the HPA axis, and the filing system and survival mechanisms stop working. And while the hippocampus works to encode and store memories, it's disrupted when fear kicks in. This doesn't mean that memories aren't being processed at all. It just means that they're not being stored, and the retrieval, therefore, is very difficult to access. And you'll see that there are two types of encoding listed on the slide. Super encoding is the first one, and minimal encoding is the second. Super encoding occurs when you remember something very well, and this can happen during trauma. For example, you might be able to remember a picture on a wall in a room where a traumatic event happened, but if someone were to ask you, hey, what time were you in that room? You may not recall. And this is because the brain super encodes signs of danger. So the next time you see that picture, you may feel as though you are about to experience some sort of danger, right? For survivors, what we might encounter is that they may be able to recall what happened at the very beginning of a sexual assault, but not a lot of the other details that may seem more minuscule, I guess. And this is when we see that the hippocampus may switch to minimal encoding. I believe the timeline for this is about 5 to 20 minutes after. And this occurs with those things that we might not remember, like what time it was, right? So this is why the first part of the attack may be ingrained in a survivor's brain, but the rest is very difficult to recall. Stress can also impair retrieval, as well as alcohol. Those can certainly worsen encoding, but I do want to stress that it doesn't stop the process altogether. On the other hand, rape date drugs like Rohypnol, do prevent encoding memory altogether because that is their sole purpose. But this is also why that FETI interviewing technique is so valuable. We can try to see if we can ask the survivor about, sensations, pain, pleasure, details like that can then be built upon just to get out more information from them. So now we're also going to move into the discussion on the phases the body goes through during a distressing event. And you will see that we have some emerging terminology listed as well in the next slide. So I'm assuming that for many of us, we have become familiar with the phrase fight or flight and additional terms like freeze, faint, and fawn. And these have historically been used to describe the ways and behaviors in which an individual may respond when experiencing a traumatic event. Recently, Dr. Jim Hopper, who is a neurobiology researcher and End Violence Against Women International, has suggested shifting the terminology used to describe the response to trauma from fight, flight, or freeze to survival mode, habits, and reflexes. So you guys can see on this slide in particular that the terminology in bold, survival mode, habits, reflexes, those are his terms that he's coining for the situation. And then fight or flight, self-protection, freeze, tonic immobility, collapse immobility, and dissociation. Those are more common terms that you and I might be more familiar with and what we're used to. It is his belief that these new terms more accurately reflect the physiology and behavior behind responses to trauma. And we have broken down these types of responses that we will discuss today into these categories provided by Dr. Hopper and Avawi. However, today we will still be exploring the term fight, flight, or freeze and the behaviors that some individuals may engage in when experiencing trauma. I do want to say that while we do not discourage anyone from exploring the reasoning of the proposed shift to habits and reflexes, it is our belief that this terminology can possibly be damaging and suggest that survivors of sexual assault have quote unquote like poor habits or choose the incorrect response when experiencing trauma. In contrast, our fight, flight, or freeze terminology explores what is known as the defense cascade. And this is a series of ingrained, evolutionary, as well as involuntary responses that may occur when someone experiences trauma. This, in our opinion, better reflects the idea that survivors are not at fault and therefore are not to be blamed for responding a certain way or incorrectly by freezing or not fighting back, because these are very much normal physical responses, and we just really want to ensure that we are being respectful. So those will be the terms that we will be using and referring to in this presentation, but feel free to do further research on Dr. Hopper's definitions. And then I do see a comment to describe the differences between tonic immobility and collapse immobility. We do have dedicated slides on that in just a few minutes, so we will be discussing that, of course.
So now I'm going to talk to you all about the defense cascade, which Summer just mentioned. When all of this is happening in the body, how is that presenting behavior-wise? This is what is known as the defense cascade. This is the motions that someone will go through when they are under threat. When moving through this cascade, this is not one and done. Someone can flow through these responses, so they may go from fight to freeze, back to fight. The defense cascade is a continuum of innate, hardwired, automatically active defensive behaviors in response to threats. And this Venn diagram breaks down how the body decides how to respond. So this is all going to begin when fear starts to kick in. Typically, a survivor appraises the situation, and if it believes that escape is futile or possibly fateful, then survivor instincts will kick in. And I'm going to go over a few of those. So the first one I want to talk about is arousal. This is what happens when you feel your muscles tense, your breathing and heart rate increase, and that's what's happening when your body first prepares on your action. When your brain first notices that threat around you, this is what's starting to happen. And then there's fight or flight, which is the active defense response for dealing with threat. Freeze is the fight or flight response on hold. And then there's tonic immobility, which again, Summer just said we do have dedicated slides on this later, so like we'll go deeper into it. But tonic immobility is the inability to move or call out. You kind of just shut down in the face of fear. And then collapse immobility is a variation of tonic immobility, but it's the loss of muscle tone and changes in consciousness. Tonic and collapse immobility are responses to inescapable threats or strategies of last resort. So, what is the benefit of understanding these reactions? Targeted interventions to help survivors understand the basis of the defense response can help alleviate the guilt or other negative emotional reactions that some survivors may feel, which can also help to alleviate the self-blame that a lot of survivors may partake in.
Thank you, Cameron. So the first element of the defense cascade is orientation, social engagement, tend and befriend, which was just presented in the previous slide by Cameron. And in order to explore this element of the defense cascade, we will be explaining a method someone may explore in this part of it, which is known as self-protection habits. So these would include non-confrontational responses to unwanted sexual behavior. Apologies. So you might see a survivor or just someone in general use phrases like, "Hey, my partner will be mad," or "I don't have any condoms on me," "I have an early day tomorrow," "My friends are looking for me, now's not a good time." So when these self-protection habits don't work, that is when our other defense cascade kicks in, which Cameron will explain next.
So I'm going to be talking about fight, flight, or freeze, and I'm sorry because it's really a tongue twister for me, but it is important to know that these are evolved responses that when the amygdala detects fear, it halts all other processes that normally happen in the brain. We evolved as prey and we evolved to freeze first and then flee if possible. So I'm sure most of us have heard of fight or flight, and we probably wondered what we'd do in this situation if we were faced with something that was a threat. What we often don't realize is that before we fight or flee, our body experiences something else. And that's when your eyes are widening, your pupils are dilating, your hearing is becoming more acute. This is all the body essentially preparing to fight or flee, but neither is necessarily going to take place because there is a third response that we often don't talk about, and that is the initial freeze. Freezing occurs when the amygdala, which is part of the fear circuitry that Summer mentioned earlier, detects an attack and signals the brainstem to inhibit movement. It happens quickly, automatically, and it's beyond our conscious control. This freezing is the brain's response that allows an individual to enter into a state of vigilance for incoming attacks and to process avenues of escape. However, the brain may remain frozen by transitioning into tonic or collapse immobility. So our brain is really just trying to help us assess the situation, but because it's not a conscious decision of ours, we often aren't able to transition into the fight or flight and we get stuck there.
So now, after looking at the different ways the body can respond to fear, we can now discuss tonic immobility a little bit more in depth. Essentially, this is an uncontrollable paralysis and tenseness in response to intense fear. You might see that survivors describe this as freezing up. It is usually onset at the point of touch. So some survivors may say that it was during penetration. But it doesn't have to be just penetration. It could just be someone even touching your shoulder or just touching some part of your body, and the brain realizes that what is occurring is not okay. So going from this tension to homeostasis period is also fairly quick. But during tonic immobility, our heart rate may increase as well as respiration, our muscles tense up. And you guys can see that it is a very common response. In fact, up to 70% of survivors experience tonic immobility during sexual assault. And I apologize if you guys can hear, I think there's a cop car ambulance outside. So apologies if there's extra noise in my background.
So now I'm going to be talking about collapsed immobility. When you are talking about collapsed immobility, they may also be unable to move, but it's on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's often described as your body feeling like a rag doll. So instead of tensing up, you're going to lose muscle tone, your heart rate is going to decrease, and you may lose consciousness. The return to homeostasis from collapsed immobility is a lot slower than we see with tonic immobility. And you will see this in the wild with it, like the example of a possum playing dead. This can explain why victims of sexual assault fall asleep right after someone was raped. A lot of people will say something like, oh, well, she slept over right after it happened, so she couldn't have been raped. But this collapsed immobility is what can explain why that happens. It disrupts the signals from the brainstem that ordinarily maintain muscle tone, so it renders the individual both immobile and collapsed. And in response to brain hypoxia, the individual also experiences a change in his or her level of consciousness. So now I'm going to play you a video of an impala. So I want you to pay attention to the changes in muscle tone and breathing and watch it as it slowly returns to homeostasis. It had lost muscle tone and then it was limp and then it gets to a point where it's barely breathing. But once it comes out of this state of collapsed mobility, it returns to homeostasis. So just pay attention for those different things. So I think that video does a really good job of like walking you through what's happening as it's happening. But as you could see when it first, I don't know, is that a leopard? When it was first being attacked, it was really limp. And once the leopard left, you saw it slowly start to breathe again. And then it was able to get up and run away after it had come back to its senses.
Yes, so there's a lot of examples of both tonic and collapse immobility. For example, for tonic immobility, sharks, chickens, fainting goats, those are all very common examples. We've provided a little bit more animations here just to give a clear depiction, but with collapse immobility, we'll see this in, I believe, hognose snakes, possums, and impalas. And you might be wondering, why are we talking about animals when we're presenting on the neurobiology of trauma and human survivors, right? But as already mentioned, humans engage in both tonic and collapse immobility. And it's very important to talk about examples of these responses in real life as well as among other species, because you might encounter survivors engaging in self-blaming behaviors such as, why did I freeze? Or why didn't I yell for help? But explaining that this is one, a physiological response, but two, that it is a physiological response that happens in other species as well, can help survivors alleviate any self-blame, and recognize that it wasn't their fault, nor was it their choice.
So another possible neurobiological response is disassociation, which I think I saw some people mention and the activity in the beginning with the what you know. Disassociation, it can be a sense of feeling blank or disconnected from the body. So that's kind of the image we have on the left. It can look like a variety of different behaviors, but typically survivors describe it as feeling blank, disconnected from the body, or almost above their body, or feeling like they have entered autopilot mode. Sometimes that means the survivor may do exactly what a perpetrator tells them to do, because entering autopilot can be a survival response. I'm sure a lot of us have had this feeling before of like just entering autopilot and not really realizing what's going on around you. That's what disassociation is.
So this is going to be a video of a cat and a mouse, and it is a great example of the defense cascade in action. And you will see the mouse specifically be the one to go through the different methods of defense. I do want to put out there that even though it may be nerve-wracking to watch, just like the previous video, I do want to assure you guys that no animals were harmed in this video. So Cameron, if you want to play it, and then we'll reconvene. So hopefully you guys took some time to also just jot down some of your own thoughts about what you guys witnessed in that video. But to summarize, you can see that the mouse was going back between freezing and fighting. My thoughts get a mouse, yes. The mouse is going back between freezing and fighting, and the mouse is initially limp. There's a minimal respiration rate in the beginning, and it comes out of the immobility response and enters a fight response with the cat. And it seems like you guys got it correct in the chat. So I'm really glad to see you guys participating in this content that we're presenting on. And in sum, this video just really demonstrates how someone can move between these different defense cascades. So thank you guys for participating.
So now I'm going to talk about the consequences. This is short, but survivors may experience increased self-blame, doubt, and may be less likely to report because they don't understand that these responses that they're having are completely normal, and they may be blaming themselves for their response, not knowing that it's something they can't control. And some studies have found links between tonic immobility, depression, and PTSD.
So, to continue this discussion further, we are now going to talk about how the brain uses attention and focus. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about specifically top-down attention versus bottom-up attention. So, top-down attention is the internal guidance of attention and focus. And it's really essentially like what will help us meet our goals. For example, looking at the main goal and like what we want to achieve, and then focusing on the subset of actions that can help us reach that goal. This is different from bottom-up attention, which is attention driven purely by external stimuli. So there's this fear response, and you're looking at the raw sensory input. Additionally, it is involuntary. It's survival based, and it's determined by fear. So you see that there's a picture of someone holding a gun, right? So if someone's pointing a gun at you, you might only be able to focus on the gun in front of your face and not the actual individual who is holding it. So when someone asks you later, hey, can you describe what the person looked like when you were held at gunpoint? You might not be able to recall because you were driven by fear to focus elsewhere. And this is the exact same for survivors, right? If they are driven by bottom-up attention, where they're focused on the danger and the threat that is facing them and harming them, they may not be able to recall different information right away. And hopefully in the next activity that we do after this slide, you guys will be able to get a little bit of practice of understanding bottom up versus attention a little bit more. So Cameron, if you would like to move to or I think Alyssa, if you can put on the whiteboard. So this is a whiteboard dot activity. If you guys are able and willing, we would really appreciate if you guys could drag the correct dot to the description to differentiate between bottom up versus top down. So bottom up are the blue circles, and you would match that to the respective definition, and then the top down are the black circles. And look at you guys already crushing it. Yep, you guys got it. So I'll give it like 5 more seconds because clearly you guys are experts at this, which is great. But you guys got it correct. So bottom up attention would be the survival based, the reacting to external stimuli, whereas the top down attention really focuses on the ability to plan, goal oriented, voluntary, whereas bottom up would be the opposite, involuntary. So thank you guys so much for participating. It's really great to see that you guys are not only just participating, but grasping this content so quickly.
All right, so when we look at the differences in response and brain activity between most perpetrators and most sexual assault victims, there are some pretty stark differences, which I'm sure we all thought that already. But in the typical perpetrator, the prefrontal cortex is what's in control. So it's definitely what's going to be in more control than the emotional brain, even if the perpetrator is acting compulsively. So the perpetrator is able to think clearly and they're able to carry out a planned sexual assault, and they're able to use their prefrontal cortex to direct and modify assaultive behaviors that are practiced or even habitual. So they're going to be the top down of what we just looked at. For the victim, the fear circuitry is what's kicked in, and the victim is terrified and overwhelmed. And so the prefrontal cortex is what's going to be almost entirely shut down. Their thoughts are going to be driven by the perpetrator's actions, and their behaviors are controlled by emotional reflexes and sometimes partly by habitual responses to aggression and domination that they may have first developed in childhood. So the perpetrator is going to be top down, and the victim is going to be bottom up.
So, when talking about trauma-informed services, it's also important to be aware and address secondary victimization. This is essentially re-traumatization following sexual assault due to contact with different professional service staff, such as law enforcement, investigators, service providers, medical staff. And it is also difficult because survivors are going through the system having to recount something that's very difficult for one, but then also having to recount that story and that trauma, and I guess for lack of better words, relive it in a way for some people when they are going from professional to professional when seeking support and care. And this can be caused by victim blaming, mistrust, negative judgments, and in turn, it causes increased trauma, increased shame, and may make survivors actually disengage from services. One study actually found that 90% of victims encountered some sort of secondary victimization behavior when encountering with law enforcement. So when we learn about these statistics, it becomes clear that trauma-informed services are crucial in order to prevent this from occurring. And of course, although we don't necessarily think that survivor or providers have any sort of malicious intent, the nature of the system can be very hard on the survivor. So just keeping that in mind, as advocates, as service providers in general, that we really want to support the victim as best as possible. And of course, we want to ensure that, we're getting the important information, and we're trying to, help them heal from this, but ensuring that we are also being trauma informed is extremely important.
Just before I move on, because I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat, so I just caught up on it, and Alyssa did point out that any of these questions we're seeing, we will answer either later on or in a follow-up email, but I did want to bring attention to this one comment. It says, "It seems to me that planning can also be survival oriented," and this is speaking purely from personal experience. I guess, I don't know how old people are on this chat, but Summer and I are Gen Z, so we were very much raised in the generation where from the get-go in kindergarten, we were running school shooting drills. And so planning in that way is survival oriented, but whenever we were actually faced with the alert coming through, everyone kind of tends to forget the plan that was first established. So that is just speaking from personal experience, but planning definitely can be survival oriented. It's just more of whether you're able to carry it out when something happens. So next I'm going to launch a poll. Who would you be willing to share the details of your best sexual experience with? And this may seem like a really odd question, but I will explain it in a second after we get some answers. Okay, so a majority of you right now are saying your best friend, and the runner-up is no one because that's private. and very few of you are saying anyone or my coworkers or my sibling. Okay, yeah, so most of you would only share with your best friend or no one. So if you asked me who I would be willing to share my best sexual experience with, it would probably be a very short list. I would also probably say my best friend, but other than that, I don't really think I tell anyone else. But why am I asking you guys this question? If you're unwilling to share your best sexual experience, how can you expect someone to share their worst sexual experience? When someone reports for support, we are asking survivors to share potentially one of the most traumatizing experiences of their lives, and we are asking them to share this experience with a complete stranger. When we think about trauma-informed services, we want to ensure that the response to survivors is trauma-informed, meaning that clinicians and other service providers need to recognize the signs of normal trauma reactions, strengthen response by communicating in ways that best serve trauma survivors, adapt services to avoid causing increased trauma. This is easy to do when you include the following values in your service, which I will be showing you on the next slide. So the 6 values of trauma-informed services are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, empowerment or voice and choice, collaboration and mutuality, cultural, historical, and gender issues. When we think about trauma-informed services, they can and do look different across service providers, but the 6 core values are going to remain the same.
So, along with this discussion, we wanted to provide some general principles for all survivor or all service providers, in the sense of do's and do nots. So, I'll be listing and discussing the do's of general service providers. So, when providing service to a victim of a sexual assault, it is imperative to understand that there is no such thing as a perfect or typical victim. Keep in mind that forgetting details of an assault is perfectly normal, but to that same token, there are also exceptions. So if a person or a survivor, I should say, does remember a lot of details, that does not equate to them being dishonest about their experience, right? There's no one or right way to go about processing trauma. And this has been the main topic of this discussion that we really want you guys to focus on. Survivors obviously then may experience a wide range of behaviors and emotions like sadness, irritability, flatness, hyperactivity, restlessness, laughter, right? All these things we discussed a little bit earlier in this presentation. And we also know that an impaired prefrontal cortex, right? The front part of the brain that is responsible for planning and decision making and the executive function, it's also limits the ability to think rationally when someone is experiencing trauma. So, alongside with that, I want to also emphasize that there is no way to prepare for a sexual assault. It can be difficult to know the best choices. And the way the body responds to trauma, including freezing or collapsing, remember, that's not a choice. So if survivors can remember something that they're comfortable talking about, you can ask them, hey, do you mind telling me more about this or that? Are you comfortable sharing more about this or that? That sort of thing. But really just emphasizing there's no typical or perfect victim. The way they recount their experience, whether it be regarding memory, that's dealing with the hippocampus, right, and encoding memory, or their actual behavior in terms of emotions, and how they go about their life. There's no right or wrong way. And we really just want to ensure that we're all showing up with compassionate care for these survivors.
So now I'm going to go over some of the general do nots as service providers. We generally want to avoid the question why. While we may have very good intentions in asking why questions, we don't want to unintentionally victim blame, and it's important to remember that survivors may recall more details after at least 2 full sleep cycles or 48 hours, and that it's normal to have very clear memories of certain sensory details, like we talked about earlier. And the video mentioned, like, she remembered the smell of cigarette smoke, but she couldn't remember other important details. But we miss out on contextual information. There are always going to be exceptions, just like Summer said, so we do not want to be skeptical of the person who remembers everything in chronological order and with explicit details, because some people's brains just work differently and they process trauma in different ways. But again, we don't want to ask why. We don't want to ask why they didn't fight back or run or act rationally, because they have no control over what is happening to their body. So next, I just want to go over some important takeaways. Trauma-informed care is mutually beneficial. It's going to help survivors avoid secondary victimization and get the help they need, and service providers are able to do their job more effectively. Alyssa is going to launch one final activity. It's going to be the third part of the first activity, so the what you learned and the what you know, what you wonder, what you learned. Seeing a lot of good responses, a lot about the different types of immobilities and responses. That was also the first time I watched this presentation. I think this was my biggest takeaway, was the difference between tonic and collapsed immobility. Super encoding and minimal encoding. The freeze response is way more complex than just not moving. Don't ask why questions. These are all really good. Awesome. Your body reacts in ways you can't control. I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways, is that the responses you experience during a traumatic event it's no one's fault. It's automatic. You have no control over it. And it's really important to remember that. Awesome. Good job. All right. I think we can. Perpetrator uses prefrontal cortex. Yeah. You guys learned a lot. Yay. I think we can wrap up the whiteboard now. Then I'll go back to sharing my screen.
All right. Well, that wraps up our training on the neurobiology of trauma and trauma-informed response. I just want to say thank you guys so much for attending the SAVAT session. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to really dedicate yourselves to learning about this content, but also in turn dedicating yourself to survivors. I know it's a lot of material, and by no means you guys need to have this information memorized, and certainly we do not expect survivors or anyone to even be thinking about this in terms of, responses and whatnot. If you guys do have any questions, I think we do have a little bit of time. I will say that it might be better and more recommended for you guys to email us questions, so that way we can give a more thorough and prepared response. But just want to say thank you guys for attending today. And thank you, Alyssa, for also helping with the whole Zoom and training and setting everything up. We really appreciate it. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, I don't think Cameron and I's contact information is there, but you can always reach out to Alyssa, who I believe just set everything up, and then we'll get the questions, and then we can always follow up with you guys as well. But yeah, thank you guys so much.
This is the general email. So if you email that, will be forwarded.
I'll also add that you'll receive a follow-up email later today with a copy of today's training recording, the PowerPoint slides, the evaluation link, and I'll also include Cameron and Summer's contact information. So you can email them directly, or as they said, you can email our general account and they'll be able to access your questions that way. And I also have copied over all of everyone's questions from the chat. I'll be sharing those with Summer and Cameron. Hopefully, if we have those answers by the time I send the follow-up email, I'll send them in the follow-up email. If not, I'll send an additional follow-up email with the answers to the questions. So thank you all again for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow.